It's good to be back from Peach Valley. We had a very good week at the camp there. If you've never been to Peach Valley, I would encourage you maybe next year to go out and visit on Thursday night. That's when visitor night is during Peach Valley, and it gives everyone an opportunity to see the camp. It's not a very big camp, not a ton of campers, but it's a special place where the kids learn to be servants, and we really enjoyed it. And it was hot. But it was good. Before I do begin this morning, I did want to thank the congregation personally for your prayers for our son Easton as he was going through his protracted illness, and for over 2 weeks he was struggling with the sickness, and we were concerned about it. And you were constantly asking about him and praying for him, even sending him cards in the mail, which he loved to get. And so as your Christian family, we really appreciate you showing concern for him. We think he's finally over whatever it was, and we're grateful for that, for the Lord delivering him through that. But we appreciate your encouragement and help during that time. When I was a child, there were times where my grandfather would surprise me and wake me up early in the morning, real early in the morning. And he would ask me, "You want to go fishing?" And man, I love to hear those words. I was excited. My grandfather didn't always take me to do a lot of things, but when he woke me up early in the morning and asked me if I wanted to go fishing, I was wide awake when that happened. Well, somewhat awake. I would fall asleep again on the way to the fishing hole. But there was something about going fishing with my grandfather that just has a special memory of my mind that I can still, even when I think of it today, I can still feel as if I'm there. The crispness of the morning air, the stop at the bait shop on the way there to grab some bait, watching the sunrise over the water, kind of expectantly and excitedly waiting for the bobber to go beneath the water line early in the morning. And I loved every minute of it. And I'm sure that maybe some of you here have some special memories that happened when you've gone fishing, maybe with a grandfather or a father or loved ones. But the amazing thing was that it did not matter, and I remember this so well, it didn't matter how long I had to wait without a bite. Because there was always the expectation and the excitement that there possibly might be a bite at some point. Hours could pass, and yet I would still not want to leave because we might miss that one fish that was going by. The big one might come, right? But of course, there always came that time where you had to admit defeat. You had to pack up the tackle box and the fishing poles, and you had to leave for home. And let me tell you, there is nothing more disappointing to a young boy to have all of that hope for a day of fishing and not even get a single fish. That is disappointing, and maybe you have felt that disappointment as well. But interestingly enough, Luke uses the disappointment of a bad fishing night to introduce one of the most well-known Christian leaders, and that is Peter. And we see this introduction in Luke chapter 5. I want to encourage you to be opening your Bibles and turning with us there. This morning is where we'll be focusing as we continue our study through Luke. But dirty, empty fishing nets and frustrated fishermen. It seems like an odd place to find faith, right? Especially of someone like Peter. Especially of an apostle. And yet that's exactly where we discover Jesus beginning his commission and calling of his most trusted men, the apostles. But the closer that we look at this scene, as common as it might seem, I believe we will find great comfort for our own faith and even greater conviction in our own faith. And maybe we will help to understand our own faith better by seeing Peter's initial call to faith, this fisherman and his faith. And so this morning I want us to look together at the faith of a fisherman. The faith of a fisherman in Luke chapter 5. Let's read together verses 1 through 11, and then we will jump into the text. It says, on one occasion while the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he was standing by the lake of Gennesaret. And he saw 2 boats by the lake, but the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. Getting into one of the boats, which was Simon's, he asked him to put out a little from the land, and he sat down and taught the people from the boat. And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we toiled all night and took nothing. But at your words I will let down the nets." When they had done this, they enclosed a large number of fish, and their nets were breaking. And they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both the boats, that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on you will be catching men." And when they had brought their boats to land, they left everything, and they followed him. What does this faith of this common fisherman have to say to us today? Well, the first thing I think that it shows us is that Jesus isn't afraid of a smelly faith. Jesus isn't afraid of a smelly faith. It's interesting to me today that, generally speaking, in Christianity, when we're wanting to look to people for bastions of faith, we often maybe look to ministers or to theologians or to scholars. And they have a place, no doubt, in the church. And we don't need to have an anti-scholarly mindset as some might have. But it's somewhat comical to me the way the tables are flipped. Because in Luke chapter 5, Jesus places the fate of the universe in the calloused, rugged hands of a common, everyday fisherman. There's nothing really special about Peter. There's nothing, I imagine, that would make Peter stand out to the rest of his town. He's just the construction worker that you walk by on your way to work, or the coffee barista that you get your coffee from. He's just a normal, everyday person. But all of a sudden, Jesus is calling him and encountering him. And this, of course, is the beauty and the mystery of the gospel, that Jesus commissions the common man into kingdom work. A few fishermen, a tax collector, and a ragtag group of men changed the world. That's what happens in the New Testament. They weren't scholars, they weren't theologians, but as is accused of them in Acts chapter 4 and verse 13, they were uneducated, common men. That's how they're described in Acts 4 and verse 13. They were uneducated, common men, but they had something different about them. They had been with Jesus. It says there in Acts 4 and verse 13. It says they marveled because they were uneducated, uncommon men, but they realized that they had been with Jesus. Now we need more scholars, we need theologians, we need respected ministers in the church, no doubt. But the local church could change their community. We could change our community if a few uneducated, common men and women would simply spend time with Jesus. That's the message of Peter's faith. There's nothing amazing about Peter. There's nothing that makes him stand out. He's just an everyday, normal guy. But he spends 3 years with Jesus. And he changes the world because of that time. And so this morning, if you're an elementary school teacher, an electrician, a plumber, a janitor, a stay-at-home mom, a government worker, common, everyday folk, Jesus has a place for you in His kingdom. Jesus has a place for your faith. Jesus has a place for your struggles. Jesus has a place for you. And He values you. Regardless if everyone else looks over you, regardless if everyone else looks at your job or your station or your influence and they disregard you, they don't pay attention, walk right past you, that's not what Jesus. In the midst of this crowd, Jesus sees a fisherman and He says, I can use that man in his imperfections. And Peter had the imperfections, as we will see in a moment. But many times I think... Many times we expect faith to come with a bow on it. The packaging's all pretty and ready to be presented to the church and to Jesus. But if we've been following Jesus long enough, we know that faith isn't that simple. It's not always that pretty, and it's not always that easy. The reality, as we see in Luke, as Luke shows over and over again, faith is often a struggle. And we see that struggle beginning in Peter here. The reality is that faith isn't always pretty. In fact, it's often rugged and ragged, smelly and salty. And sometimes there's days where we feel convicted, we feel confident in our faith. Those are the good days. And other days, not so much. Other days we feel weak. We feel like cowards because we are fearful of talking to someone about Jesus, or maybe we give into a temptation that we thought we had overcome. And suddenly that confidence and that conviction that we had the day before is turned into groveling on our knees at the feet of Christ, saying, "Depart from me, for I'm a sinful man, O Lord." I don't know, maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm the only one who goes through ebbs and flows of my walk of faith. But the reality is, I think, is that many of us, if we're honest with ourselves, realize that faith isn't a simple trajectory into heaven where you just keep on climbing up and you never stop. It's more like going through the hills of this area. It twists sometimes, it turns, it goes up, it goes down. But we must simply keep our eyes on Jesus, as Peter learned to do. But the interesting thing is that Jesus doesn't reject that faith. He doesn't say to Peter, "Peter, I don't have a place for you." And rather, He commissions that faith. He uses that type of faith. He gives that faith a job. Because whatever Peter has here, this common everyday fisherman, this is what Jesus is looking for. It might not be what the world is looking for, but it's what Jesus is looking for. And Jesus isn't afraid to use it. It might not be perfect, but He will perfect Himself through it. Now, this isn't going to be the last time that Peter doubts Jesus. In fact, he is going to deny Jesus 3 times, as you may remember. This isn't going to be the last time that he questions a command of Jesus. Remember? "I'm going to go and I'm going to be killed." "No, you're not." Peter says, "No, you're not. I won't allow that." But patiently and gently, Jesus transforms Peter from a fisherman to a fisher of men. He molds him. The second thing that I think we learn from our text this morning is that the majesty of Jesus transforms the monotony of daily life. The majesty of Jesus transforms the monotony of daily life. Have you ever had a long day at work where you really don't feel like dealing with other people? I mean, you've had this day where everything has gone wrong, or maybe for some reason you just woke up on the wrong side of the bed and you've done everything you can just to get home. And you don't really feel like dealing with people. It's amazing to me how often it is those days where it seems like other people need you the most, right? They can't call on the other days when you're in a good mood. They just happen to call on the days where you really don't feel like dealing with other people and their problems, because you're just trying to make it to bed with your own problems and hoping for the next day to kind of restart, refocus, and refresh. You just want to get home and relax. Have you ever had a day like that? That's Peter right now. That's Peter at the beginning of this chapter. Okay? Peter has been fishing all night. Okay? Now this isn't a hobby of Peter's as it is for often. This is how he makes his living. This is how he feeds his family. This is how he makes his trade. And so all of a sudden he's going home and he's going to have to tell his wife, "Honey, we don't have dinner for tonight. Or we're just going to have to eat leftovers." They didn't have any leftovers back then. But we don't have anything. He is frustrated, I imagine. He is aggravated. He is exhausted to the bone. And the last thing Peter wants is to deal with people. And yet, he gets out of the boat. He starts cleaning his nets. He's ready to go home. He turns around and there is a crowd of people behind him. And there's this weird guy who's all of a sudden, he's heard something about, but now he's asking if he can use Peter's boat when all Peter wants to do is drag it up on shore and get home. "Can I use your boat, Peter?" Sure. Whatever. I imagine this is the last thing Peter wanted to deal with. And then Jesus crosses the line for Peter. Jesus begins commanding Peter about his trade. Right? Launch out into the deep, Peter. Catch some fish. I mean, you can almost hear the irritation in Peter's voice. In fact, if you're reading from certain translations, there might be an exclamation point after Jesus says, "Master, we've been toiling all night." All right? "I'm not really in the mood for this, Jesus. I've been toiling all night. I'm tired. I'm hungry. I want to get home." You fish during these days, you fish during the night. You didn't fish during the day because of the type of fishing they did. You fished more in the shallow waters than you did in the deep. So what Jesus is saying here, I want you to go fish out in broad daylight, out in the deep waters, makes absolutely no sense. And it especially doesn't make sense to an aggravated, frustrated, weary to the bone fisherman. And it's almost as if you can see Peter saying, "Listen, Jesus, I know you've got this carpentry thing down and this teaching thing down, but let's leave the fishing to me." He says, "We've been toiling all night, but at your word, we'll do it." This isn't convenient for Peter. This isn't comfortable for Peter. But what we discover many times in our own life, and what Peter discovers here, is that God's blessing is often found in inconvenient obedience. And that's what Peter discovers here. Now I want you to notice that when Peter initially does this, there is no faith in Peter's action. I mean, I can't help but read that in the text. He doesn't really believe that this is going to work. I mean, he's just been toiling night after night, hour after hour, and nothing has happened. But he's going to go ahead and do it. But then all of a sudden the boat starts sinking. And the nets start straining. And his fellow laborers are calling out for more boats to come and help them. And you can almost see this dawning awareness in Peter's eyes. I mean, can't you see his face? Standing on the shoreline, seeing this happen. And as the boats are sinking, Peter's faith is rising. And Peter's exclamation, once he sees this, almost seems out of place. It almost seems odd. He's not excited. He's not jumping up and down for joy. He's not patting Jesus on the back. He turns down. He falls on his knees, almost clinging to Christ, and he says, "Depart from me, for I'm a sinful man, O Lord." Now notice the transition there. Before this event happened, it was Master. After the events happened, it's Lord. I think there's a significance in that. Peter suddenly realizes that in the boring cadence of his daily life, something truly wonderful has happened. And suddenly life is so much more than dragging up smelly fish all day. And this is the reality of Jesus that we see in this encounter. Because if Jesus is who He says He is, if He did what He did, if He is going to do what He promised, then life, your boring, mundane, everyday life is so much more than what we so often pursue and value. And if we could just see that. If we could just see that. So many of us keep dragging up the same old smelly nets of the world. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life, hoping that they will bring abundance when they are just full of holes. And that's where Peter was. And I think that as God's people, we must pray that the Lord will help us to see the majesty of Jesus in the monotonous moments of our day, to reflect and to meditate on His person and His promise, to allow His beauty and His wonder to transform His life, to fill us with what Scripture says is hope. Hope. That what you're doing in your daily life matters because of Jesus. And with the flip of a switch, Peter's morning is transformed from frustration to confession. Like Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 6, he sees the majesty of Jesus and he recognizes his unworthiness. Isaiah in Isaiah 6, he sees the glory of God. He says, "Woe is me, for I am undone." And Peter sees the glory of Christ and he says, "Depart from me." This is what holiness does to a person. And Peter realizes there is something special about this man. He's not the ordinary rabbi. He's not the ordinary teacher. He's not some everyday carpenter. There's something else here, and what he just did has changed me dramatically. And here's the irony. He wants Jesus to depart, but he is desperately clinging to him, falling at his knees. That doesn't seem like the gesture of a man who wants someone to leave. But that reminds us maybe of our own faith as well. That we realize our own sinfulness and we say, you don't belong here, Jesus. We don't deserve for you to be here, but we desperately want him to stay. It reminds us of another character that Luke is going to tell us about a few chapters later in Luke chapter 18. The tax collector who can't even look to heaven. He says, "Lord, have mercy on me, for I'm a sinner." And when Jesus sees that faith in someone, when Jesus finds someone who really realizes who he is and really realizes who they are, Jesus looks at that faith and he says, "I can work with that. I can work with that. I don't care if they are the last person in a 7 billion population planet. I can work with that." And so Jesus transforms the monotony of daily life. His majesty transforms that. Thirdly and finally, what we learn from our text this morning is that mission means that we drop the nets. Mission means that we drop the nets. Faith and confession aren't enough for what Jesus is calling Peter to do. There must be a type of repentance, if you will, an acceptance of commission. Before they can follow Jesus, they have to drop the nets and they have to leave everything behind. And discipleship is about dropping the nets. Can you imagine how absurd it would seem for Peter to say, I'm following you, Jesus, and then he kind of tries to sneak behind and kind of drag the net behind him as he's following Jesus along the shoreline? That's not what Peter does. He leaves the nets. He leaves the net. I want you to think about that for a moment. This is the greatest catch of their life. I mean, they've never had such a haul as this. This is the big one that everybody has been waiting for. And they leave him on the shore to rot. But what's catching fish when you're called to follow the one who made the fish? Here's the mission now. Jesus says, you're not going to catch fish anymore, Peter. You're going to catch, as one translation says it, you're going to catch people alive. Now, that's an interesting translation, but that's really the appropriate translation of that word, because it's a word that was often used, interestingly enough, of prisoners of war that would not be killed, but captured and kept alive. And so this entire time, Peter has been fishing for things to consume, to kill and consume. But Jesus says, you're going to catch people alive. You're going to go out and you're going to catch people, and you are not going to destroy them or consume them or use them for your own selfish purposes. Rather, you're going to liberate them. That's what I've called you to, Peter. And this is what we have to realize as the church and as Christians. That the commission of Christ is about people. It's about people. It's about loving and investing in people. Investing time and effort and money and love into saving people. Not to use them for our own selfish purposes, but to free them. To free them to know God. This leaving all mentality is kind of difficult for us to wrap our minds around, because on one hand, Jesus does call for certain people to leave everything, and they do leave everything to a certain extent. And He calls for the rich young ruler to sell all that he has, but yet many of us would say, well, that isn't necessarily what Jesus means for us today. And I would admit that Jesus doesn't require you to sell everything that you have and give it to the poor. But I do think that this leaving all mentality is an essential part of discipleship. And what it means is that it's a mentality which would, at the drop of a hat, sacrifice time, finances, and popularity for the gospel. Jesus, you need my time? I'm there. Jesus, you need my finances? They're there. Jesus, you need me to sacrifice my influence and my popularity for the proclamation of the gospel? I'm there. It's done. It's not that big of a deal to me. I don't care if I leave it behind. I don't care if I leave the greatest haul of a lifetime, because I have Jesus now, and He's all I need. That's discipleship. That's what Jesus is looking for in the church. And I'm so grateful that we have those kinds of people here in our church. And we have elders here that are like that, who will, at the drop of a hat, serve the people of this church. In fact, one of our elders did that this last week for our campers at Peach Valley. I made a blunder. I admit when I'm wrong. Gerald graciously had taken the kids to Peach Valley in the van on Sunday, because I had to preach that evening, and we had guests in, and so he graciously, I was so grateful that Gerald was willing to do that. And I texted him a few days before, and he was like, yes, absolutely, I can do that. He was willing to do that for Hensel. So we have men like him that are willing to do that. And then about Thursday evening, I started thinking, I did not check with Gerald to see if he could actually pick up the kids. I know he could drop them off, but I didn't know if he could pick them up. So I texted him. He said, man, I wish I could. I have a huge catering. I don't think I can make it out there. So I was in a bind. Our kids were about to spend an extra week at Peach Valley Camp. And so I texted Tracy and then let him know the issue. And all of a sudden, Roland called me and let me know that he was going to drive down there and pick up the kids. And all week we have been talking about servant leaders. And we are blessed in this congregation to have servant leaders. We need to thank them for that, and thank men like Roland for sacrificing time at the drop of a hat to do that for God's people and for others. So this is what the leaving all mentality is all about. And what it means is that saving faith eventually must leave the shallows. Saving faith must eventually leave the shallows and launch out into deeper waters. But the amazing thing is that the Lord promises abundance. Which command of Jesus do you not trust Him to fulfill? Which command of Jesus do you look to and say, Jesus, we've tried that before, thanks but no thanks? Which command of Jesus are you not willing to launch out to the deep? I wonder sometimes if we treat evangelism like that. Jesus says, if you go out and you sow my word, it will not come back to me empty. It's going to produce fruit. It's going to produce disciples. And yet we look at evangelism and say, yeah, Jesus, thanks, but no thanks. We've tried that before. It didn't work. Which command of Jesus do we not trust Him to bless? In my office, there's a picture of this sea that Luke is talking about. He refers to it as the Lake Gennesaret. In this passage, it's actually the Sea of Galilee. The Lake Gennesaret was a more common title that was used back in Jesus' and in Luke days. So he was very good at his historical accuracy here. But I have a picture of the Sea of Galilee that John gave me as a gift before he left, hanging in my office. And that's all it is, a picture of the sea. And I love that picture because it's a place where Jesus did some of His greatest work. And the sea calls to us. That sea calls to us. It beckons us. It calls out to our faith to leave the shallows of once-a-week Christianity and to pursue an all-out, passionate relationship with Jesus Christ. A pursuit of God. And so the question for us this morning is, what nets are we allowing to drag us down? What nets do you keep pulling up, hoping that they'll give you happiness and meaning besides Jesus Christ? But the reality is that it's not the confessing faith that Jesus doesn't use, it's the conceited one. And we often convince ourselves that Jesus can't possibly use us in our brokenness and in our failures. But that's the thing about grace. It only uses broken things. And Peter he fished all night, and he came up with nothing. It was only through the grace of Jesus that abundance was brought in. Now this morning, there are some nets in your life in which you keep dragging up, and maybe you're sitting here thinking that Jesus can't possibly use you in your brokenness and your failures and your weakness and your struggles. But grace uses broken things. And Jesus promises abundance in Him. If you need Him, if you long for Him, if you wish to submit your life to Him this morning, whatever your need is, why don't you come forward? Together we stand and sing.